In storytelling, a character arc is defined as the transformation or journey that a character makes over the course of a story. This journey usually happens as a product of the character starting with a specific perspective and orientation, and then through facing a variety of challenges and experiences, they are forced to reevaluate that perspective and change for the better, or sometimes worse. The best stories, the ones we love, have a satisfying character arc, where we as the viewer or reader or player empathize and understand the changes that a character goes through. We connect to this because we see our own reflection in the humanity of these imaginary beings. We consider how we might respond if we found ourselves in one of these fantastical situations. If suddenly we woke up after 100 years to see that our world had changed and we had a fantastic destiny before us. Or that the world as we understood it was very different than the world that we knew. Or we discovered or acquired a talent that can make us unimaginably wealthy as long as we were willing to play a role, and so on. The stories we love and remember usually have one or two characters whose arcs impact us in a meaningful way, so we come back for more. The thing that makes this such a valuable tool in storytelling is that it reflects real life, because in real life we are all changing and growing, or sometimes regressing based on the experiences and conditions that we face as we travel through our own story. In real life, we've seen these stories play out. We've seen former heels turn face and former faces turn heel. We've seen people at the bottom land on top, old bitter rivalries end in friendship. We've seen minstrel comedy relief characters turn into arch villains, and we've seen agents of chaos and disorder become beacons of hope and growth. It is in that last category we find Mike Tyson. Once the most feared and genuinely scary black man in the world, embodying all of the elements that we tend to celebrate black men for, as well as all of the elements that we are feared for. He dominated an era both as an athlete and a media icon, only to then fall to the lowest point both professionally and personally. Tyson is a star who at a time was so big that the side characters in his story also became legends, for one reason or another. His image and presence defined an era and resonated not just in black spaces, but worldwide.
Turbo, Shintojo, Tyson power!
However, it's his most recent chapter that to me is most fascinating. So in this episode of the Black Media Breakdown, I'm going to do my best to look at the epic character arc of Mike Tyson. I'm going to examine how one man can touch on so many different aspects of the black experience, while also reflecting on what his legacy and presence meant to the culture then and now, and what value he can still bring to the culture despite his ugly history. All this coming up on this episode of the Black Media Breakdown.
Fragmented.
There's no better allegory for the range of outcomes that any one black man can have than to follow the life and career of one Mike Tyson. Through looking at Tyson and analyzing his arc, we can see almost every aspect of what it means to be black in America. The rage, the glory, the perseverance, the growth, the failures, the monstrosity, and the man. It's all here to see in Mike. But to make sense of him, we also have to make sense of the forces that created him, and not just poverty and disorder, but why a man capable of such antisocial and destructive behavior could ever captivate the world the way he did.
Green suffered an injury to his eye, Tyson a hairline fracture to his right hand, and who knows how much damage to his reputation.
In order to effectively talk about Mike, we have to fully conceptualize how a man with the level of social dysfunction that he has, with the history of violence and abuse that he comes from and himself produced, could ever manage to become such an icon for a generation. Even in the 80s and the 90s, well before the Me Too movement and modern feminist movements, well before we really were PC, a man like Tyson with his actual background would find it difficult to be so beloved by the world. Figures and TV characters like Archie Bunker, Andrew Dice Clay, Benny Hill, Uncle Luke, they were all relevant during this time, and they were problematic in their own right, maybe less so than Mike, but they were still culturally significant, but never had the profile that Tyson had. To put it in perspective, Tyson in his prime was probably as big or a bigger sports star than Michael Jordan. He was definitely better paid. So consider how much effort Jordan put into his public image. Conversely, Here's Tyson getting into street brawls and facing accusations from women constantly in the late 80s, early 90s. The reason for this is that Tyson was a modern day gladiator. Now I know I've brought this up before, but I'm going to dive deeper here. In those ancient times, the gladiator fight started out as a way to honor the dead at funerals of important and powerful people, but they resonated so much and became so popular that these same powerful people began holding them just as entertainment for the masses. They noticed that gladiator fights were good for social cohesion and peace. The reason is that the experience of watching these men in this violent spectacle somehow helped create a soothing catharsis that kept normal people from tearing each other apart in everyday life. It kept the peasants from fighting with each other or showing up at a noble household with pitchforks and torches. This need for regular people to connect to the mostly controlled violence of the gladiator is not new. Many cultures and civilizations throughout time around the world have had similar entities, from the ancient Olympics to the dance rituals of the Zulu warriors in Africa to the Maori haka that we often see today being performed before sporting events. I don't know exactly what to call it, but there's a definite affinity we as a species have for the vicarious consumption of violence. And the men who participated in these sports, much like today, were considered heroes and celebrated wherever they went. They were looked at as paragons of courage and strength, idealized as images of manhood. Warriors and gladiators have always been a protected class in society, even when they were actually technically slaves themselves or the underclass. They were allowed certain rights as privileges as long as they fulfilled that role. However, these protections disappeared as soon as they couldn't. We'll be coming back to this. No modern sport exemplifies all of these things more than boxing and combat sports in general. I've always been fascinated with boxers, not boxing so much. I'm just a casual fan of the actual sport, but the athletes that make up the sport are to me some of the most fascinating people and provide some of the best and most fascinating stories for us to consume, both in real life and in the media.
You know what I'm talking about, man. You know what, I dare you to sit up there and say, explain. You know what I'm talking about, man. He's fighting people. You know we've been fighting 400 and still fighting to this day. To this day. To this day.
There's a reason why some of the best sports movies are about boxers or fighters in general. To be a boxer is to aspire to the ultimate performance of traditional masculinity. To dominate by sheer will or prowess another man, one-on-one, is the very mythology that modern masculinity is built upon. Boxers are pillars of not just strength and tenacity, but discipline and strategy. Boxing is about power and finesse. It's about dominating another man, not just physically, but also mentally. At the same time, though, like other sports, boxing is a safe space where men can celebrate other men, glorifying traditions and hierarchy, as well as finding comfort in following other men in leadership and gatekeeping roles. Finally, probably more than any other sport, boxing is about a high-profile superstar lifestyle full of attention, accolades, riches, and women.
Johnson generated just as much, if not more, publicity outside the boxing ring. He refused to hide his relationships with white women, which many found outrageous in the US at a time of widespread racial segregation.
Boxers perform masculinity at an idealized level, and the world celebrates them for this, often while turning a blind eye at everything that has to go into that performance, and the consequences that we often don't see until it's too late. Sports already serves as a unique role for men in general. As I just said, for many men, a field or a court or a ring may be the only place where they can feel free. The confines of manhood often limit the range of humanity that men are allowed to exhibit and experience. It sometimes feels like men, especially black men, are only allowed to safely exhibit three emotions: lust, anger, and reverence. This is why whenever you see an image of a black man doing some normal shit like sharing an intimate moment with their child or another man, people sexualize it or celebrate it. It's not possible to just have it be normal in the rage of black male behavior. Bell Hooks said it perfect when she wrote that black males today lie in a world that pays them the most attention when they are violently acting out. Little boys are taught from the time that they can walk that they're not to cry, express fear, conflict, joy, or pain. Everything from the types of toys that boys can play with to the colors that they wear to the way they engage with their friends is policed in order to maintain an appropriate performance of masculinity. But on the field, you can see everything else. We've all heard the myth that men aren't emotional, and to this day, I can't understand how anyone who's ever seen men watch sports could think that. On the field, you see joy, you see bonds of friendship and physical intimacy. You see pain, you see hurt, you see fear, you see doubt. The problem is that these emotions are only allowed here because they're confined within this sport. And apart from this sport, somehow these men are just supposed to turn the rest of their humanity off. I hope I don't have to explain how unhealthy that is, because I'm not. We got to get to the meat of things here. The men like Tyson that can truly compartmentalize their emotions, that can go flatline, which is often a result of significant prior trauma, can get a serious edge at their giving sport. Men who can flip that switch and shut out every other emotion in order to be focused on their opponent or task tend to be more successful. But that ability to just turn off and on parts of your humanity is a dangerous balancing act that most men can't keep up for long. And the more violent and intense the sport, the more severe the boomerang effect when this balancing act breaks down. But I'm getting ahead of myself because a lot of this is about the second half of Tyson's arc. In the beginning, while Tyson was the baddest man alive, no one had any concern about what was happening with him emotionally and psychologically. Nobody seemed to care or notice what was going on behind the scene. Nobody cared because he was a gladiator. Everything else was fine until it wasn't.
He's going to be able to continue. He's got the heart, but his body won't let him do what his mind wants to. And he's counted out. It'll be scored as a knockout. Mills Lane counted him out to 10. It's all over. We've got a brand new heavyweight champion of the world, Mike Tyson. I'll try to burn him.
Kids who get into trouble usually have a great deal of pent-up energy and they don't know what to do with it. Well, Mike Tyson was one of those kids. It was the great boxing trainer Gus D'Amato who finally turned Mike's life around, took him under his wing and rechanneled Mike's energies into boxing. D'Amato feels that Tyson will be the next Muhammad Ali, and he should know. Ali was also one of his students.
Tyson is your classic got it out the mud story. He grew up surrounded by abject poverty and criminal activity. His mother ran a brothel out of her home, and the man he knew as his father, who probably wasn't, was a pimp. He speaks to witnessing his mother have sex with men in their home and him hearing and seeing everything. Tyson says he never got the type of attention and affection that he saw his mother give to her clients, and that this maybe is at the core of some of his problems with women. Tyson also talks of being sexually assaulted when he was 7. Tyson was a troubled and rough kid and was arrested nearly 40 times by the age of 13. He had low self-esteem and was incessantly bullied due to his high-pitched voice, lisp, and gap teeth, let alone how poor he was. Tyson's mother died when he was 16, and he was adopted by Gus D'Amato, his then trainer and boxing coach, who trained him into an elite boxer and provided him with stability for the first time in his life.
Being part of Gus D'Amato's family was therapeutic. He gave him direction, he gave him order, he gave him care, loving.
Tyson's teens were spent in the D'Amato family. Gus eventually adopted him.
Stability didn't necessarily mean guidance, as D'Amato didn't always encourage health and wholeness from Mike. He just effectively managed his antisocial behavior and kept his focus on the ring and staying out of trouble. Even still, D'Amato and his crew were the closest thing to a family Tyson ever had. D'Amato built Tyson's confidence and pulled him away from a life of petty crime and probably an early death. Unfortunately, D'Amato would pass less than 4 years later.
The street kid, and I would come with like a tough kid. I never had an ego. I was never really jealous of anybody. I never really thought much of myself. But when I met Gus and I started talking to Gus, he made me believe that I was a god. He made me believe that, for instance, Gus would say this. Now, to Gus would say, now you hear this? Because Gus had really, he had this really megalomaniac ego. He said, let me tell you something. You, all the prophets, all the gods you ever know about, if they had a son, their son couldn't beat my fighter. You know why? Because he's my fighter.
One thing people don't fully get was that Tyson was only 20 years old at the time when he was demolishing people. He was still basically a boy, a hurt and traumatized boy at that. We think of Patrick Mahomes as a young, talented legend in the making, but Patrick Mahomes is 25 years old right now. Imagine if Mahomes had won his first MVP season at 19. Tyson's brain was literally still developing while he was getting hit in the head by grown-ass men and becoming the richest athlete in the world. He relied on that chosen family from D'Amato to keep him grounded and keep him focused intensely on boxing, and it worked. If you stop and think about it, you realize how insane it is that there are men who literally fight for a living. Despite our deep-rooted love of violence, people in the civilization live every day seeking to avoid conflict, let alone assaulting each other. Boxers, on the other hand, are literally taught the science of conflict, the art of hitting people and trying not to be hit back. Cus D'Amato was an Einstein of fight science, having trained 2 other world champions before Tyson. But the thing that's truly special about D'Amato isn't the technique that he taught about the physiology of fighting, it's the psychology and philosophy that stands out.
All people are afraid. Being afraid is a very normal, healthy thing. If an individual were not afraid, I would have to send them to a psychiatrist to find out what was wrong. But nevertheless, faced with a situation that intuition tells us danger is present, these natural assets that nature gave us to survive come to the surface. And if we don't panic, we maintain a discipline and a control over them, we can use them. And they not only will help us survive the particular incident, but continued success will give us a confidence that is so strong and a foundation so powerful that in time we can get to overcome almost anything.
But in Tyson, D'Amato understood he was dealing with a different breed, and he knew he had one last chance to distill Tyson into his perfect pupil. With Tyson, he had the canvas to create a mythic monster. All he had to do was follow and trust him. In exchange for structure and family, Tyson had to become the vessel for D'Amato's greatest creation, Iron Mike Tyson. And what Iron Mike Tyson meant to D'Amato was the weaponization of fear.
As soon as I come into the ring, I'm gloved. No, stop it. That's not true. While I'm in the dressing room, 5 minutes before I come out, my gloves are laced up. I'm breaking my gloves down. I'm pushing the lever in the back of my glove. I'm breaking the middle of the glove so my knuckle could pierce through the leather. I feel my knuckle piercing against the tight leather gloves on the Everlast boxing glove. When I come out, I have supreme confidence, but I'm scared to death. I'm totally afraid. I'm afraid of everything. I'm afraid of losing. I'm afraid of being humiliated, but I'm totally confident. The closer I get to the ring, the more confidence I get. The closer, more confidence I get. The closer, more confidence I get. All during my training, I've been afraid of this man. I thought this man might be capable of beating me. I've dreamed of him beating me, but I always stayed afraid of him. But the closer I get to the ring, I'm more confident. Once I'm in the ring, I'm a god.
I want to go back to my love for Muhammad Ali for a second and look at him. And even further to days like Joe Louis and Jack Johnson. Showmanship and spectacle was a major part of boxing, especially as African Americans became centerpieces of it. Big hair, fancy ring gear, flamboyant personas and theatrics. This is all a big part of being successful because being a boring and straightforward combatant wasn't going to sell tickets to pack arenas. As such, at the time, boxing was full of plenty of spectacle. But for Tyson, this just wasn't a realistic route to take. He didn't have the personality to pull that off. Tyson didn't trust people. Tyson was a true street kid and had a high-pitched voice and a lisp. As such, he didn't talk much, but he watched people carefully because he didn't trust people. This made his presence a bit unsettling. D'Amato let that guide him. He leaned into that. So Tyson barely spoke or showed emotion before fights early on. He would walk to the ring with no music, maybe just random noises of metal and chains clanking, with black trunks with no fancy name on it, no fancy robe, just a towel with a fucking hole cut into it, or no shirt at all, already sweating. He would get in the ring and he wouldn't make goofy faces at his opponent for the most part. He would just stare at them like food, then proceed to viciously knock someone the fuck out and leave. With Iron Mike Tyson, D'Amato found a way to manifest and weaponize fear in the boxing room. Mike would stare into the souls of older, larger, more experienced men and render them heartless. More than his legendary uppercut, this command of fear is what made Tyson unstoppable and made it impossible for us to look away. When you saw some of these punches, you understood why he was feared. You recognized that Mike was just different and nobody wanted anything to do with him. I mean, look at this dude. This dude could clearly get his ass up and continue fighting. Like, he's looking at the ref like, nigga, count faster. Most Tyson fights at this time were much smaller, but the spectacle was building and people wanted to see the ferocious beast who stood shorter than most of the men he faced, cartoonishly clobbering adult men, knocking them out sometimes with his first few punches. Today, Floyd Mayweather is the biggest boxer in the world, but if you've ever watched a Mayweather fight, it's been for two reasons probably. Because either A, you truly love the art of boxing science, of which Mayweather is a master, or B, you hate him so much you're hoping to see someone finally shut him up and knock him out. If neither of these things is in your head while watching a Mayweather fight, I don't know what you're watching it for. You're probably wasting your time and money, because Mayweather never puts on the type of show that Tyson did in his prime. Mayweather hasn't knocked anybody out in like 20 years, and even that one was sus. Conversely, in his prime before losing the title, Tyson had knocked out 16 men in the first round alone. At this point, Tyson is the world's id. In psychoanalytic theory, the id is a part of three forces in the human psyche: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is a person's true desire and needs. It's passion, lust, anger, joy, hunger in its purest form. So when a person steps on your new Jordans, right, your id says, I'm gonna punch this motherfucker in the mouth. On the other hand, the superego is moral and seeks to do the right thing based on the standards of a given society. When a person steps on your new Jordans, the superego says, you know what? I'ma chill. Everybody makes mistakes. I'm sure it was an accident. Besides, if I hit this person in the mouth, I'm gonna go to jail, and violence isn't the answer. The ego mediates between those two. It looks to satisfy the id without breaking the superego. So it says, okay, we're not gonna hit this dude because it was an accident, but I'm gonna give him this aggressive look like Mike Tyson would, and maybe say something under my breath. And if he swings, then I can claim self-defense and whip this motherfucker's ass. The constant subjugation of the id is important to a civil society. We can't have people just doing exactly what they want every time, smacking people every time they get mad, fucking people every time they get horny. So through Tyson, society got to vicariously purge the needs of our collective id. With every fist that hit a face and every body that hit a canvas, it was a feeling of excitement that had never existed before and couldn't be found anywhere else. The thing that we fail to consider is what price is paid to the person who has to play this role. Furthermore, what does it say about us that we love this spectacle so much, yet turn a blind eye to the damage and cost that it takes to entertain us? We don't like to think of our gladiators as human. We like to maintain the spectacle. We don't want to think about the hard work that goes into it or the toll that it takes on the person, let alone the ugly parts of the game that we never see, at least not until it's too late. Tyson states that early on in his reign, he was clean and he wasn't whoring left and right. But as his star grew, it's clear that dysfunction started, and we didn't care at the time. And of course, we didn't know the depth of the trauma that he experienced before getting to this point. But if we did, we probably wouldn't have cared. As long as we got to see him perform, we wanted to connect to our id. That's what we wanted from Mike Tyson. Men wanted to be him, women wanted to be with him. We all wanted to stare at awe at the detached, predatory eyes he gave other fighters before the bell, and then the calm but murderous aura he gave off after it rung as he dismantled challenger after challenger with ease. Even as I say all this, even as you watch it, knowing everything about this man's story, it's still captivating, isn't it? It's hard to turn away. And right on cue, when it began to spiral out of control, when it all came crashing down, we hid our hands, we laughed, we turned up our noses, we rejected the very idea that Tyson could have ever truly represented us and captivated us the way he did. Tyson was our id, but we were the ego. And in order to reconcile our love for him with our superego, we looked away as his star came crashing down to earth.
The Mike Tyson story started on Sunday when his car hit a tree near his upstate New York training camp. Tyson was knocked unconscious for almost a half hour.
Mike goes around crying out for help.
At 20 years old, by the time Tyson defeated Trevor Berbick for the World Championship, Don King was already in the picture, considering that he was one of the top promoters at the sport. And after the death of Jimmy Jacobs, who was a holdover from Custom Models camp, King eventually was able to come in and take over Tyson's career in the middle of Tyson's reign as champ. King was one of many famous snakes to have fed off of Tyson's career, and probably the most depraved. Like, this man has been sued by almost everyone he's worked with. He is still an unabashed supporter of Donald Trump, who he worked on with multiple fight promotions, Givens. Oh, and he actually has killed 2 people. Yeah. One dude he reportedly stumped to death because he owed King $600. Like, this motherfucker, this is who we had to trust. This is who Tyson had to put his trust in to keep him out of trouble. At the age of 20, Tyson suddenly had the world at his fingertips, but absolutely no one of quality to guide or protect him from it. And like many in his position, he was immediately swarmed by sycophants and vultures who wanted a piece of him. People tend to look at Tyson's marriage to Robin Givens as the beginning of the end for him as he was before, when his dysfunction became visible and undeniable to the public. I was young at the time, but I vividly remember overhearing the conversations, and the immediate reaction to the marriage was mostly negative. People didn't quite know Tyson's level of dysfunction, but they at least felt like Tyson wasn't normal enough to maintain any decent relationship, especially with Givens, who at the time was a burgeoning superstar and was a beauty icon within the black community. It was immediately looked at as a mismatch. Givens was a polished Hollywood product, private schooled and college educated, and her relationship with Tyson immediately gained her accusations of being a gold digger. Now, Givens does have a scandalous resume worthy of a hot girl song in her own biopic. There are many rumors about her attitude and conniving ways at the time, but that's nothing new to women in Hollywood, especially black women at the time. She did tout herself as being a Harvard medical student, but the record on that is looking real Umar Johnson-like. She had beef with some of her contemporaries and got her big break after being a mentee of Bill Cosby of all people. Lastly, she did reportedly date Michael Jordan for a time before Tyson, resulting in an infamous confrontation between the 2 years later. The stories contend that her and her mother were constantly at odds with Don King's camp over control of Tyson and his money. That one time while Tyson was away, they were somewhere in a bank trying to pull money out of his account. Tyson alleges that he was manipulated by Givens and her mother, that Givens said she was pregnant when they got married, and 7 months later, after not having gained a pound, she suddenly says she had miscarried and never got around to telling him. Givens, on the other hand, alleges that Tyson was abusive and unstable, which, I mean, come on, y'all, yeah. Most of this comes from the now infamous interview with Barbara Walters, where Robin shares these accusations and Tyson mostly just blankly stares.
You and your mother around in Russia. That Mike has a very volatile temper. True?
Extremely volatile temper. I think people see that about every 3 months. He's got a side to him that's scary. Michael is intimidating, to say the least. I think that there's a time when he cannot control his temper, and that's frightening to me or to my mother.
At the same time, when I watched this interview with her as an adult with full knowledge of who Tyson was at the time, it's hard to see her as this manipulative mastermind. Here's Tyson, this goon who never finished high school, had a criminal history, and literally beat men to death for a living. Yes, Givens may not have been the innocent and put upon victim, but it's hard to think that Tyson wasn't everything she said he was. 2 things can be true at once. Givens could have been seeking to increase her spotlight by attaching herself to the most famous black men in the world, and Tyson could have been unhinged and abusive towards her in the process. They were divorced within a year, and his public profile has never been the same. Whether you look at Givens as a snake or not, if you do a little bit of digging, you'll recognize that at this point in his life, Tyson was spiraling out of control. He was a rampant drug user of everything from cocaine to morphine. He used to have to wear a fake penis to pass drug tests. He says that around this time, he stopped caring about boxing. It was only interested in partying and women. The knockout still came though, so despite him descending into addiction, it didn't seem like anything could stop him. Nobody cared. That is, until... Douglas versus Tyson is one of many stories from Tyson's career that can be its own movie. And in fact, I actually heard it might be. At the time, Tyson was in the thick of his issues with addiction, both to drugs and sex, and was not focused on boxing. Reportedly, he was getting knocked down by his sparring partners. He was slow and lethargic compared to his old self, which is sad because at the time, Tyson was only 25 years old. He supposedly spent the time before the fight, which was held in Tokyo, Japan, touring Japanese brothels.
Mike Tyson and I were in Japan. We basically stayed up all night partying with 12 Japanese girls And
yes, Bobby's a good multiplier, but yes.
He walked into the fight with the whole world expecting yet another early knockout. No fighter had taken Tyson past the 5th round since 1987. Douglas, on the other hand, was buoyed by the numerous challenges in his personal life. Douglas was 2 years removed from splitting with his father's management. Douglas's father was also a boxer, and after a major loss they split and Buster set out on his own to prove himself without his dad. He also had to contend with the sudden loss of his mother less than a month before the fight hit.
Fear was a lot of Tyson's weaponry in the past when he was at his greatness. The fighters came in almost frozen, almost the prey of a cobra. But Buster Douglas, by his mother just dying, he had no fear. What do I care? That just happened to be the perfect timing that he had.
Douglas had little to lose and everything to gain, and his confidence before the fight, contending that he shocked the world, was seen in the same light as the bluster every other fighter presented before fighting Tyson. Nobody was expecting what would happen. However, when the fight began, it was clear that he would make good on his confidence. From the onset in the pre-fight matchup, Tyson didn't see himself. His body language spoke of boredom and disinterest. He still had the same detached look in his eyes, but everything else was different. Like, here's Tyson before his match against Spinks, the biggest fight of his career 2 years earlier, and here he is here. Douglas battered Tyson with jabs the whole match, effectively using his reach advantage, which every other taller fighter before him was unable to do because of Tyson's speed, head movement, and punching power. To add insult to injury, literally, Tyson's cornermen weren't even fully prepared for the fight.
Tyson's left eye was swollen shut. It was soon apparent that Tyson had another problem. His corner was simply not ready for the fight. Coach Aaron Snowell failed to make sure they had the proper equipment, such as an end swell and ice in the case of cuts. They tried to cure Mike's facial injuries with a rubber glove filled with ice water. After the fight, trainer Teddy Atlas issued the famous phrase, "Dumb mediocrity gathered in Tyson's corner." They couldn't even train a fish to swim.
Still, Tyson was a monster with once-in-a-lifetime power, and he seemed like he would escape having learned a lesson but not lost everything when he downed Douglas in the 8th round. But a slow count by the ref along with the bell saved Douglas and kept this upset chance alive. Smelling blood, Tyson came out swinging the next round, only to get caught with a combination that almost knocked him out. But still, he would survive this round, but not the next.
Chilling, I'm fucking amazed and shit. I'm gonna knock this nigga out. I've knocked everybody. I knocked niggas out to knock them out. What's the problem with this nigga, right? So, as we know, that didn't happen, right? And now you have to deal with that with yourself. Yeah, you arrogant fucking nigga. Who do you think you are? Do you really think you God, motherfucker? You're a fucking uneducated nigga that just learned how to fight, and you unappreciated piece of shit. This is how you treat it. You don't work out. You don't train. You gotta deal with that.
Tyson credits this moment with saving his life and putting him on a better path, though it might take some time for that truly to happen. But the aura and cloak of invincibility was gone. The beast had finally been wounded. Still, at least in his own head, Tyson was able to refocus and get back to his craft. Tyson won his next 4 fights, 2 of which by first-round knockout. However, it wouldn't last long before he was derailed by yet another scandal. I don't want to go into Tyson's rape case in too much detail. If you're watching this and you were there at the time, you probably already have an opinion on what may or may not have happened. And if you aren't aware, please feel free to do the Googles and make your own decision. At the time, much like now, there wasn't much support for rape victims. Powerful men and athletes always got the benefit of the doubt in situations like these, and as far as I can tell, the culture as a whole was on Tyson's side, much as they were for many an athlete after him then and now.
8 in the night. Number 2, she's dancing in a beauty contest at 8 in the morning, and I saw the tapes, and I see the big smile on her face, and she's dancing happily at 8 in the morning. And now Mike Tyson's in jail for 4 or 5 or 6 years. I had a real problem with that case. I had a real problem with Mike Tyson's lawyers. I had a real problem with Don King. I just think that he was really fed out to the wolves.
But if in fact he raped her in that hotel room, regardless of whether she came there, you think that he should have been convicted and should have gone to the slammer?
He to this day denies it. I don't know that it happened, and I think that As they said, if he didn't testify, he would have been exonerated totally. The jury said that.
I'll just say, considering who Tyson was at the time and the numerous accusations that had been made about Tyson and women and the actual result of the case, I don't see how anyone could think that he isn't guilty of what he was accused for. But regardless of your opinion, understand this: Tyson is a convicted rapist. He was convicted in court and went to jail for it, point blank period. To this day, it's not easy for rich or powerful men to be convicted of any crime, let alone rape. So for Tyson to have been convicted of anything should have been enough to indicate his wrongdoing. It's the fact that this is such a minor footnote in history that says a lot more. It goes back to what I said about gladiators. Because Tyson was viewed in such a way, the fact that he might have happened to hurt a woman was no big deal. Like, there's probably still people who hate Mike Vick and Colin Kaepernick that paid to see Mike Tyson fight Roy Jones. For what it's worth, to this day, Tyson still denies any wrongdoing. He's admitted so much and outright stated that there's many things he's done that he should have went to jail for, but he does not to this day think that what happened that night was not consensual, so there's that. Either way, Tyson spent 3 years in jail and came out of prison having converted to Islam, and a change, man, I'm just kidding. He was still fucked up. Tyson says that he was just as bad in jail as he was out of it, having even gotten a female prison guard pregnant while he was inside. People that know him say he came out more unhinged despite being surrounded by the NOI, who normally add a layer of structure wherever they go. They were an overall upgrade in terms of security around Tyson, but the reality is that he was still a sex and drug addict, still unstable, still being managed by Don King, and as a byproduct of that, accruing significant debt. Despite returning to the ring not long after being released, Tyson was spiraling worse than before. He continued fighting, mostly in his eyes, to get paydays. He had long since lost the passion for the sport. And boxing analysts will tell you that he wasn't the same fighter skill-wise. His aura of invincibility had deteriorated, and although he put away a few scrubs that were served up to him as appetizers, he struggled to put away Riddick Bowe and lost twice to Evander Holyfield. The second one being a disqualification after the infamous incident where in front of millions we watched as our id, at its most unhinged, bit a clear chunk off Evander Holyfield's ear and spat it out on the canvas. I was old enough to watch this with a sense of my own superego, and I remember for myself, along with most people, that this event, not the rape case, but this second embarrassing and fantastic loss was the moment that Tyson lost the heart of the people. Despite losing his license to box, Tyson made it back to the ring for a few more wins before being knocked out by Lennox Lewis in 2002. This third loss against a fellow boxing legend in the same phase of their career finally irreparably destroyed Tyson's legendary status in the culture. For that short time while Tyson was in prison, Lennox Lewis, Evander Holyfield, and Riddick Bowe bounced around the title of top guy. But the whole time, the whole world was still in love with Mike Tyson. They would say stuff like, "Wait till Mike get out of jail," or "You just holding that till Mike come back." But after struggling with Riddick and losing to both Holyfield and Lewis, the id was fractured, leaving Tyson to fend for himself, broken physically, psychologically, and economically. He was no longer the nation's id. His violent and destructive ways were no longer an entertaining byproduct of his destructive and violent ring persona. His gladiator status revoked, he was just another brute. This period began the sideshow portion of Tyson's career. Tyson's last professional fight ended when he refused to come out from his own corner. Tyson struggled with his weight, popped up with his infamous face tattoo, and had multiple run-ins with the law. Tyson also lost his 4-year-old daughter in a freak accident in his home while he was away.
At her home in Phoenix. Police there say Exodus Tyson was pronounced dead just before noon. The 4-year-old was found unconscious on the treadmill with her head in the loop of a cord that was apparently hanging underneath the console. Investigators say it appears to be an accident. The Tyson family released a statement simply asking for privacy.
His drug use is no longer the product of a partying lifestyle, but a part of pain management and self-hate. I remember when Tyson showed up randomly in The Hangover in 2009. It was his highest profile public appearance since his fight with Lennox Lewis. It occurred that even then, Mike had officially entered into the final phase of his gladiator career, becoming a sad shell of his former self. He looked fat, bloated, unhealthy, and miserable. However, finally, for the first time ever in his life since he was a child, Mike's world was empty and mostly quiet, except for the people that truly cared for him.
And he took me to this guy, and for some reason I was a guy, it's a street guy, rob, steal, do anything, shoot you out. I was a savage, I was a monster, nobody cared, I didn't love myself. That's why I showed it by acting like a savage. And this old white Italian guy said, he told me I was handsome. He thought I was handsome, and he told me I was good, and he gave me 5 or 6 life affirmations. And then all of a sudden I thought my name should be reigning with Alexander the Great and Achilles. Where did that come from? How did that happen? I'm nobody, I'm a bum, my mother and my father were nothing. This guy told me a few words and I took those words in, and now I think I'm a god. Don't let me see a mirror. I never saw a mirror I didn't love. I felt madly in love with myself. I turned into a monster. I had to be humbled. And still, no, it's not true. The only reason it happened, good God is jealous of me because I'm reaching up to this level. No, I'm not going to stop. I'm never going to stop. No. Then I just had to keep getting humbled and keep getting humbled. And then I felt myself here, empty with nothing, broken. And you gotta say, what the hell am I doing here? I should be dead now. Why am I here? You know, men are not meant to be humble. Men are meant to be humbled.
By the mid-2000s, Tyson was done with boxing, suing Don King for $100 million and himself over $60 million in debt. He had no plans on fighting again professionally, but hoped to have his boxing career somehow carry him out of debt. He was still addicted to sex and drugs and had ended a second failed marriage, as well as failing as a father to all of his children. Somewhere in the middle of this downward spiral, Mike met one Lakia Kiki Spencer. And according to Mike, Kiki is the key ingredient to his recovery at this stage of his life, both mentally and financially. And that's great, but there's a concerning tradition of broken men, black and otherwise, needing to find a strong enough woman to get them on the road to recovery. I don't want to undermine this, and I want to make sure it's understood that any type of person that needs help or support when they're battling addiction and demons, that's a good thing. But the problem is that I've seen many men indicate that this is the right way to love a person, the right way to love a man who has problems. And no, I'm sorry, a good girlfriend isn't a replacement for therapy. That said, for whatever reason, Kiki did invest in Tyson's life and recovery, and it seems like her playing an effort, even when Mike was still dealing with addiction, put him on the path to recovery. It was her efforts that had Mike cashing in on his celebrity opportunities and things like The Hangover, plus a multitude of B movies and short film roles and media appearances.
And next thing you know, I'm $60 million in debt. And she just kept saying, everything's gonna be all right. We're gonna write a show. We're gonna produce television shows and movies, and this is gonna be over. And I'm looking at her, and I'm still strung out on drugs. And I'm looking at her, this bitch is delusional. And next thing you know, this way I just kept paying a little bit at a time, make some money, I kept paying.
Slowly, Mike began to whittle down his debts and work on his demons. You see this in the way he managed his public appearances. For example, here's an interview from 2010 while Tyson was still dealing with addiction, and he speaks through his discomfort and frustration on how the old him would have responded differently to an interviewer that was kind of being an asshole.
You're a different person now, aren't you?
I don't know if I am or not. I don't want to be the person I was, but I don't know, change comes in time. Change comes really in time. You're irritating me now. I guess I did change because I'm not assailing you, but you're irritating me right now because I feel that you're evoking stuff from the past. That stuff is 15, 20 years ago.
But it's made you...
In 2013, Tyson debuted his one-man stage play, The Undisputed Truth, written by Kiki and directed by Spike Lee. The reviews I read online range from looking at it as an odd sideshow to an ugly reification of all of Tyson's problems, especially with women, to a triumphant and raw examination of Tyson's difficult life. For the first time ever, it humanized the beast in the eyes of the public and put the reality of his demons out there on full display. It was very successful and helped reframe Tyson from being this sideshow oddity to this mercurial, almost guru-like figure who was able to reflect on his lived experience and offer wisdom. You hear him constantly speaking to this concept of knowing himself and dropping little jewels of insight that are maybe only possible from a person who's lived so much life. Tyson also wrote a biography to accompany the play, became vegan, and managed his weight better. Lastly, and most significantly, he invested in marijuana, which he credits greatly with his recovery, like many athletes from contact sports before him, and his marijuana company seems to be making him a nice amount of money. This is where Tyson's arc comes full circle. Having lost it all, friends, partners, millions, fame, and the respect of his children, along with a child, Tyson, at bottom, was lucky enough to have a partner with a vision for his recovery and the will to make it happen. Also, let's recognize why Tyson was so successful in this late career transition. It still very much has to do with his status as a gladiator. See, here's the thing. Once you've taken a man and you've stripped away all the humanity except for the parts that are scary, violent, and destructive, and you have this monster, society only really has one use for it, which is destruction. However, with a couple of subtle tweaks, you can turn this destructive force into comedy. It's the reason why we're so entertained by Tyson as he goes from being the guy that ripped people's heads off and literally bit people's ears to the goofy guy that dances and is self-aware and almost a bit cuddly at this point. This is actually something that happens all the time in wrestling. You take the big monster, you build him up as a monster as long as you can, you try to get him over, and once that doesn't work, or once the crowd stops reacting to it, you flip a switch and suddenly you have a novelty comedy character. I don't know what it is, I don't know what to call it, I don't have the vocabulary for it, but it is a thing. At some point in time, Tyson became self-aware of the parody that he became, and he was okay with it. For one, it helped him get out of debt, and two, it helped take him away from the lifestyle and the state of mind that kept him so unhappy and so alone for all that time. The most significant thing about this particular part of his life is that he seemed to truly gain insight into how and why he became who he became. In his podcast, Tyson regularly talks about how inhuman and unhinged he was in his youth, and how it seemed like the worse he acted, the better his life got. How his lack of discipline and emotional health was integral to his success as a fighter. How it made him an icon and made him feared. But he also talks about how unhappy he was, even when surrounded by all the spoils of his fame and fortune. He sometimes scorns the idea that he is happier now, having lost it all, and whether or not he deserves to be where he is now, considering all the things that he's done. Tyson often wonders aloud, should he feel better about himself after hating himself for so long? Tyson always talks about how he hates the man he used to be, but at the same time, he seems to realize that somewhere in there, he's scared. He's scared that that man that he hates from his past is actually who he truly is, that this is who he is when he's his most alive. Because he does miss the rush, the feeling of power and dominance, the adoration of the people. But he knows that at least for him, those feelings come with a price he's no longer willing to pay.
I'm a fucking student of war. I know all the warriors from Charlemagne, Achilles, the #1 warrior of all warriors. From there, Alexander, Napoleon, I know them all. I read them all, I studied them all. I know the art of fight, I know the art of war. That's all I ever studied. That's why I'm so feared. That's why they feared me when I was in the ring. Because I was an annihilator. That's all I was born for. And now those days are gone. It's empty. I'm nothing. I'm working on being the art of humbleness. Can you believe in me? That's the reason why I'm crying, because I'm not that person no more. And I miss them. Because sometimes I feel like a bitch. Because I don't want that person to come out, because if he comes out, hell is coming with him.
At a certain point, a lot of men, at least the ones lucky enough to see things for how they really are, learn to realize the design of the system we live in. As boys, we're sold these lines on what a man is supposed to be and how a real man acts. And we live this lie for so much of our lives. Many men never learn to recognize the farce of this ideology, that this performance that has us bottling our emotions and working ourselves to death is only in service of a system that doesn't actually benefit us. It's actually killing us, or if not that, it's straining us, our mental health, and our relationships, let alone everyone else that surrounds us and loves us. Tyson made it to the stage of this art. He remembers the adoration of the people, but he knows that this adoration is fickle and based on a lie. That the only person who will pay the price for his dysfunction for this performance is him and his loved ones. That all the cheers and adulation disappear as soon as it's inconvenient. Interestingly, Tyson also seems to understand that he isn't the only one feeling this, that men everywhere have been through similar arcs as him, feel the way he feels, and struggle with that same sense of balance. That's what so much of his podcast and his new Legends League is about, providing a space for men to reconnect with that part of themselves, but from a more introspective and healthy perspective. You see that in some of his complex, revealing, and sometimes ugly interaction with other male legends on the podcast. It's scary yet powerful that of all people, Mike Tyson is a man who is pushing the envelope for healthier masculinity and manhood in 2020. Over the course of 35 years, Mike Tyson has went from street urchin destined for jail or an early grave, to youth athletics phenom, to rising star, to world champ, to A-tier celebrity, to jail, to has-been, to rock bottom, to sideshow, and now self-help guru. It's a weird, one-of-a-kind story that captivates and horrifies. What does this mean? What does it mean about us, about the world, that a man who was as depraved as Tyson, and in some ways still is, was able to restore himself in the eyes of the world and his own life? Is the current positive wave that he has problematic? Are men like Tyson supposed to suffer and repent and disappear from the public eye forever? Or is it more valuable and important that he's having this redemption story? What does it mean to his victims, the ones we know and the ones we don't, to see him get this adulation in hindsight? I completely understand how some might be repelled by Tyson's newfound image and the positive response that he's getting considering his past. But it is the reality. When you watch these clips of Tyson's podcast and you see him and other former athletes, businessmen, musicians, and other icons crying and connecting to each other, we need men who've really been through hell to give a glimpse of life on the other side. I won't call Mike Tyson a good person or the type of man that you want to model yourself after. He still seems to be struggling with his demons, still doesn't engage with women effectively, still comes off unhinged and rambling at times. But I will say that his presence in the modern day discourse is important to a lot of men trying to remake themselves, trying to recover, trying to be better. They connect to Mike's character arc. At a minimum, you can't deny that regardless of your opinions on him, his story is fascinating and hard to turn away from. I don't know how this story ends, whether he'll be able to maintain this space of health and humility, but I hope it ends well and that the character arc for Mike Tyson completes with satisfaction.